Hi, Sheila the storyteller here again with another one of my homespun tales. Today's story is a fairy tale that might seem quite familiar to you, but it's a fairy tale from Fife because it was told in Fife hundreds of years ago and it was collected in Fife. So it's always been known as a Fife fairy tale, and it's called The Well at the World's End. Now, you see, a long, long time ago, before your time, or my time, or even your granny's time, there was a lassie called Katie, and she stayed with her mother in a wee cottage somewhere in Fife. And one day Katie's mother says, Katie, Auntie Maggie's coming for her tea tonight, and you ken how she likes a good bannock. So I think we need to make a bannock for tea. And Katie agreed to help. They got the bacon stuff out and all the ingredients they needed, and then they took the jug down off the shelf, the jug where they kept the water. Because you see, they didn't have a tap in the house in those days. They had to get the water from the well. But when they took the jug down from the shelf and looked in, it was empty. Oh no, said Katie's mum. We'll need to get some water. Katie, you'll need to go to the well. But would you go to the well at the world's end? Because it's got the cleanest, the tastiest, the sparkliest water in the whole of Fife, and it'll make a good bannock. So Katie agreed, and she took the jug and off she went to fetch the water from the well. And she walked far and far and further still, until at last she came to the well at the world's end. But oh dear me, when she looked down into the well, the water was away down the bottom, and she knew her arm wasn't long enough to reach it, and somebody had stolen the bucket that they used to draw the water up. What was she going to do? She was so disappointed. She sat down on a stone and she burst into tears. And she cried and she cried and she cried. And she was making so much noise that she didn't hear the flip flopping coming along the path. And she didn't notice anything until she heard a voice saying, What are you greeting for? What are you making all that noise about? What's wrong? And she looked down, and there, sitting at her feet, was an old yelly puddock. And she said, Did you speak to me, puddock? And the puddock said, Aye, I spoke to you, asked you what was wrong. Oh, well, Katie was so surprised. Puddocks had never spoken to her before. But she was so upset she'd tell him the whole story about how she couldn't reach the water in the well and how her mother needed it to make a bannock for Auntie Maggie. Well, the puddock turned to her and says, I could help. I could help you get that water. But you'll have to make me a promise first. Well, what would that be? Said Katie. You need to promise to marry me. You have to promise to marry me, said the puddock. Well, Katie laughed. Dearie me. But she didn't say anything. She just thought in her head that he must be joking. This must be a joke. Must be playing a trick on me somehow. No, no, no. I'll just go along with it. It'll no be true. And so she said, Aye, I'll marry you if you get me the water. And with that, the puddock jumped down into the well and started to swim about. And as it did, the water began to bubble up and bubble up and bubble up until it was flowing over the top of the well. Well, Katie took her jug, she filled it up again, and off she shot back home. And she never even stopped to say thank you to the puddock. Well, she took the jug of water home, she gave it to her mum made a bannock, Auntie Maggie come for her tea, They ate the bannock. Auntie Maggie said it was the best she'd ever tasted. And then Auntie Maggie went away home again, and Katy and her mum started to get ready for bed. They locked the door, put some peat on the fire, and they started to clear away the dishes. But just as they were going to bed, they heard a on the door. And Katy's mum said, "Who's that chapping on the door at this time of night? Katy, away you go and see who it is." Well, Katy went. She went to the door and she opened it a wee bit. And imagine her surprise when she saw sitting on the doorstep was the old yellow puddock. And it began to speak to her again. It said, let me in, my hinny, my heart. Let me in, my ain true love. Remember the promise that we two made doon at the well at the world's end." Well, Katy was just about to slam the door when her mother shouted out, "Who is it at the door? Who's that talking?" And Katy said, "It's just a clarty old puddock." "Oh, the pair things wanting in," she said. "Let it in. It must be called." So very reluctantly, Katy opened the door and the puddock hopped over the floor and up onto the table, where it spoke again. And this time it said, "Give me my supper. Give me my supper, my hinny, my heart. Give me my supper, my ain true love. Remember the promise that we two made doon at the well at the world's end." Well, this time Katy was determined to ignore it. But her mother wouldn't let her, and her mother said, "Oh, the poor creature, it's hungry. Away and go and get a bit bannock for it." So again, very reluctantly, Katy went and got some bannock and fed it to the puddock, and it gobbled it up. Then the puddock jumped down on the flare and said, "Chap off my head, my hinny, my heart. Chap off my head, my ain true love. Remember the promise that we two made doon at the well at the world's end." Well, this time Katy didn't have to be telled twice. She grabbed the axe from the side of the fire and she chapped off the puddock's head. Well, the head rolled over the floor and into the fire, and it was soon hissing and spitting and crackling in amongst the flames. And soon smoke began to drift out of the fire. Bright yellow smoke. It drifted out of the fireplace until it filled the whole of the room. And then it began to drift away again, to leave standing in the middle of the floor a very handsome young man, all dressed in yellow clothes. And Katy's mum says, "Who are you? And what are you doing in my kitchen at this time of night?" And the young man said, "I'm the laird's son. Many years ago my father fell out with a wizard and he turned me into a puddock. And I had to stay by the well at the world's end until a bonny lassie came along who was kind enough to promise to marry me, generous enough to share her supper with me, and brave enough to chop off my head." And he turned to Katy and he said, "Katy, I think that's you. Do you still want to marry me?" And Katy looked at him and says, "Well, I'll think about it." But she did think about it. And after some time had passed, the laird's son and Katy got married, and they all moved in to the big mansion house where the laird stayed. And Katy never had to go to the well for water again because she had servants to do that. And as far as I know, they all lived happily ever after. And that's the end of the story. End of a story, a fairy tale from Fife.